Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas has appeared in various pertinent American publications, New York Times, New Yorker, The Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. We continue our look at Part 1 of Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead? Part 1 is entitled, Does Science Point to God? Today is Chapter 4, The Fine-Tuned Universe. So we've already talked about some of the fine-tuning on Earth, and in our next chapter we'll continue that conversation. But for now, let's look at the fine-tuning of the universe as a whole. Metaxas says, many of us would never think about such a thing because our universe, in its impossible vastness, does not immediately seem to have any bearing on whether or not there would be life on our planet. But in keeping with our larger theme, the more science has discovered about the formation of the universe, the more we have come to see that it appears to exhibit design in a host of ways. In fact, the universe as a whole bears evidence of fine-tuning that makes the fine-tuning of the Earth seem small in comparison. The conclusion is increasingly strong, and now essentially unavoidable, that if the universe were not precisely as it is now, that life on Earth would not exist. In 2007, in a New York Times op-ed, the popular English physicist Paul Davies wrote, quote, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. The issue concerns the very laws of nature themselves. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life, and hence conscious beings, to exist. Change any one of them, and the consequences would be lethal. So if any one of these multiple coincidences were knocked out, then life would cease to exist. That's end quote by Paul Davies. Davies is not a man of faith, but he is a true scientist, meaning someone who's unafraid to deal with the facts on the table, whether he likes them or not. So Paul Davies is making a statement that theists would agree with, yet Paul Davies himself is not a theist. Scientists have been seeing what Davies writes about for decades, but only the securest among the scientists that have seen what Davies has written have been honest enough to say so publicly. Most people will not acknowledge such statements as the one just read there by Davies, because it makes those who believe in theism happy, and those who do not believe in theism unhappy. Just as anyone is disinclined to advertise unpleasant evidence against their position, scientists predisposed against the implications of fine-tuning have tended to keep quiet. In other words, Metaxas is saying there's all this evidence for the fine-tuning, and Metaxas is going through some of it in this portion of his book, Is Atheism Dead? We've gone through some of it in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist on this channel, but the vast majority of the scientific community wants to keep it out of the spotlight because it makes their position look weak. And even, as we said previously, even the likes of the late Christopher Hitchens said that this position is the strongest position that the theists have. And it was Christopher Hitchens, I believe, that we said last time when he talked amongst his atheistic colleagues that it was the fine-tuning that gave them the most trouble. But at diverse times and in diverse places, as with Christopher Hitchens in the back of the car, they sometimes let on that they know about all this and about how devastating the facts are. For example, in his widely unread 1988 bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking wrote, Quote, if the overall density of the universe were changed by that minuscule percent, several zeros in a 1%, no star or galaxies could be formed. So the density had to be specifically fine-tuned in order for galaxies to form in the universe. And remember, there's no evidence for the multiverse. The multiverse is just an invention of people trying to explain away the fine-tuning of the universe that we find ourselves in now. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before it reached its present size. End of quote by Stephen Hawking. Those are insane figures and scorchingly tall odds, but there they are. And from the mind of Stephen Hawking, no less. He certainly was not one who liked the idea of a universe fine-tuned to such a heart-stopping level, but he nonetheless sometimes expressed what the immutable facts revealed. In that same book, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking said, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us, end quote. It's funny sometimes how some atheists will suppose that God is behind some of the things that they can't deny that they can't explain. Again, considering the source, this is an outstanding admission, especially because in decades after he tried to wriggle away from this conclusion any way that he could, often manufacturing solutions to the universe's beginning that seemed intentionally difficult to comprehend by anyone clinging to the rules of common sense. Nonetheless, in his famous book, he was indisputably frank about what he saw and what the obvious conclusions seemed to be. The astrophysicist Fred Hoyle was also candid about the universe's fine-tuning, despite being a long-time and dedicated atheist. In fact, as we've said, Hoyle led the charge in wrinkling his nose at the repulsive idea of a universe with a beginning and inadvertently coined the term Big Bang. I didn't know that until reading this book, that the term Big Bang came from Fred Hoyle. But in 1959, a decade after this, he was giving a lecture on how stars in their interiors created every naturally occurring element in the universe, and was explaining that they do this with the simplest element, hydrogen. It's interesting, just as an aside, it's interesting that one of the biggest pieces of evidence that theists point to for the existence of God, the Big Bang, is a term that was originally coined by an atheist. If that's true, that's incredibly ironic. In 1959, a decade after Hoyle coined Big Bang, he gave a lecture on how stars, inside stars, had created every naturally occurring element in the universe, and they do this by hydrogen. That is amazing. Hoyle said, quote, if this were a purely scientific question and not one that touched on the religious problem, he said, I do not believe that any scientist who's examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed with regard to the consequences they produce inside the stars, end quote. So Fred Hoyle is supposing that there's design behind the universe. English astronomer, atheistic astronomer, Fred Hoyle is supposing that there's design behind the universe. But if there's not a grand designer, then where's the design coming from, Mr. Hoyle? It seemed obvious to him, and even he had the guts to say those who did not agree, to those who did not agree were bothered by this on religious grounds. Yeah, they're bothered by this because the implications that the universe that we find ourselves in contains design, the implications are there must be a designer, and if there's a designer, we're accountable to him, and we don't want to be accountable to him because we want to do what we want to do and not have anybody tell us what to do, or as Christopher Hitchens would say, who we can sleep with and in what position. I've heard him say that in an effort to be humorous in certain debate settings, something along those lines. But to him, Hoyle, it was clear, however little he liked it. However little he liked the implications that there must be a designer behind the design that is unmistakable in the universe. He said that if one did not think a designer had done this, then Hoyle said that we're back again to a monstrous sequence of accidents. And so that's one of the things about the order and design that is prevalent and evident in the universe that we see, that we have all this order, that this specified complexity, and so many other things that point to intelligent design behind the universe that we see, that it seems more logically plausible that there's a designer behind it instead of there being a specific sequence of monstrous accidents that led to everything that we have now. And Hoyle liked that conclusion even less because he knew it had to be laughably far-fetched. Exactly what I basically just said, that if there is no designer behind all the design, if there is no fine-tuner behind the fine-tuning, then none of it makes sense. It all came about on a series of accidents, according to Hoyle. 2 decades later, Hoyle went even further, writing in the Caltech Alumni magazine, "Would you not say to yourself," quote by Hoyle, "would you not say to yourself, some super calculating intellect must have designed the properties of the carbon atom. Otherwise, the chance of my finding such an atom through blind forces of nature would be utterly minuscule." Fred Hoyle's making the point that I've tried to make repeatedly. This goes back to, you can present people, non-believing people, with evidence after evidence after evidence, and Hoyle, they react like Hoyle. They see that it's there, but despite the fact that they see that it's there, they continue to reject the God that is there, that is beckoning them unto himself, because they don't like the implications of the moral responsibility that it puts on them. And I'll be honest, as a Christian, I don't always like the moral responsibility that I have, because there are some things, as a Christian, just because you become a Christian doesn't mean you stop sinning. And as a result of our indwelling sin and the war between the flesh and the spirit, we still have a sin problem, and we will until we die. And so just because you become a Christian does not mean you lose your accountability to God and to others. You still have it. So back to what Metaxas says about Hoyle. You wouldn't be finding the design that you find in the universe through processes put in force by a blind force of nature. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. This is still Hoyle quoting. The number one calculates from the facts seems to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question, end quote. So Hoyle is saying that there is a super intellect that is making things in our universe as fine-tuned as they are, and that is putting the forces of science in motion, the science that people cling to, and that is what is making things the way that they are. Hoyle is typical of those brave souls who refuse to twist the science to fit his worldview, nor to twist the conclusions away from where the science pointed, even if it was to an intelligent designer of some kind. But neither he would accept the God of the Bible as a solution to that designer's identity. He would not deny that it was apparent that there was a designer behind the fine-tuning of the universe, but he would not ascribe the design to the God of the Bible. That was a bridge too far for Hoyle to cross, and it did not seem to him necessary to cross that bridge. Surely one could be true to one's scientific understanding by talking about a designer without leaping to embrace the God who had parted the Red Sea. But just as Hoyle reluctantly came to see that science showed the universe was not eternal, but had a beginning in the Big Bang, he also saw the design of the universe from the science, even though, like Melville's Bartleby, he would have preferred not to see the design in the universe from science. From the point of view of science, Hoyle's laudable honesty concerning these things, he was disinclined to accept it. To accept is actually actually inspiring. Hoyle said, "If one proceeds directly and straightforwardly in this matter without being deflected by a fear of the wrath of scientific opinion, one arrives at the conclusion that biomaterials with their amazing measure of order must be the outcome of intelligent design." So, Hoyle is saying, if you admit the obvious, that there appears to be design behind the universe, the scientific majority is going to be unhappy with you because they don't want you to admit that there's design behind the universe, because scientism is trying to remove the influence of the supernatural from the universe. They're wanting to explain it in the non-supernatural way, the non-intelligent way. But Hoyle is saying it's obvious that it's there. The intelligent design is there. Hoyle says, "No other possibility I've been able to think of in pondering this issue over quite a long time seems to have anything like as high a possibility of being true," end quote. So now let's consider the mass of the universe that shows another example of the fine-tuning of the universe. To get specific about what details of the universe point to design, we can start with the biggest picture of them all, the mass of the universe, which is one of the most startling examples of so-called fine-tuning. Just as we can grasp the concept of Earth's needing to be exactly the size that it is, we must wrestle with the idea that the universe must be roughly the size that it is too. But as you will soon see, the fine-tuning of the mass of the universe cannot really be described with the adverb roughly. It is a level of exactness. The mass of the universe is so exact that it is essentially impossible to comprehend. First of all, the mass of the universe is not something we knew about until recently, and the very idea of what such a thing could even be is itself difficult to envision. But again, science eventually got to where it can tell us, and with an almost blood-curdling specificity. We may as well cut to the chase and say that the mass of the observable universe measured in kilograms is 1.5 times 10 to the 53rd power. That is the only observable universe, and it is a small fraction of the mass comprised of dark matter and dark energy, but we have enough to worry about without getting into that subject. To talk about the mass of the universe another way, we can simply state the number of atoms in the universe, which is about 10 to the 80th power. So a 1 followed by 80 zeros. It's, of course, amazing that we know that, but we do. Still, these are just numbers. Another way to think of the size of the universe is to say that it contains 2 trillion galaxies, each of which contain 100 billion stars, most of which are comparable to our own sun, whose diameter is 865,000 miles across. But there are not just stars in the universe, there's also a near infinity of other objects, such as planets, moons, asteroids, comets, nebulae, and so on. So these are some ways in which we can get some idea of our universe's mass. What's truly hard to comprehend, as if none of this other stuff was hard to comprehend, and this is putting it mildly, Metaxas says, is that science has determined that the mass of the universe is fine-tuned to a level that is, as we say, essentially incomprehensible. Nonetheless, according to what the physicists tell us, the mass of the universe is exactly what it must be for life to exist on Earth. Before we go to what we mean by exactly, we can dilate for a moment on why scientists believe this. For example, scientists say that if the universe's mass were the tiniest bit smaller, the elements necessary for life, that is nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon for starters, would have never come into being. So if the universe's mass were just a tiny bit smaller, we would not have been able to get the elements nitrogen, oxygen, carbon into being, and life could not have originated. Wow. This is related to the second reason, which ends up being much more interesting, and has to do with gravity. We've said that the more mass something has, the more gravitational pull it exerts. So now we understand that if there were any more mass in the universe, and we will say what any means in a moment, the gravity would be too much and would not have allowed the universe to expand from the Big Bang to where it is now. At some point, the gravity, if it were even the tiniest bit greater, would have overtaken that expansion and would have put the brakes on, so to speak. It would have eventually pulled everything back down to the objects much larger than our sun, which would have ended up as black holes and neutron stars, which are so dense that atoms themselves would be crushed. So, of course, the aforementioned elements necessary for life would have never been created, since life could never exist on the neutron stars or in black holes. But on the other side of things, if there were any less mass in the universe, then its explosion would have been too fast. So gravity would not have had the chance to create the stars that exist now, nor the planets, and so the universe would be just an endless scattering of gas and dust. But where this gets interesting to the point of maddening is when we talk about just how fine-tuned the mass of the universe is. In his book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, Caltech astrophysicist Hugh Ross gives us the frightening details. Yes, Hugh Ross is a Christian, but I guess that didn't bother Caltech enough from hiring him. Quote by Hugh Ross: "As certain epochs in cosmic history, the universe's mass density must have been finely tuned as 1 part in 10 to the 60th power to allow for the possible existence of physical life at any time or place within the entirety of the universe." End quote. Continue quote. "This degree of fine-tuning is so great that it's as if right after the universe began, someone could have destroyed the possibility of life within it by subtracting a single dime's mass from the whole of the observable universe, or adding a single dime's mass to it." End quote. A single dime's mass. You can put a dime in your hand and picture a dime in your hand now. Everyone knows the mass of a dime is almost nothing, even if you don't know the exact weight. Yet, Hugh Ross declares that is the amount of mass that would have caused the universe not to come into being. Are we supposed to take this seriously? That the mass of something as seemingly inconsequential as a dime is what could have made the difference between our existence and non-existence? How can we rationally process something so outrageous? Metaxas says. He's right, that is outrageous. And yet science has progressed to the point where it can tell us that this is a fact. In other words, Hugh Ross is probably not the only scientist who would say this. Still, the notion that the entire mass of the universe could not deviate by the mass of a single dime, the notion that the entire mass of the universe could not deviate by the mass of a single time has to be among the most preposterous statements that's ever been made in the history of language. But again, there is a monumental difficulty, because this is not the harebrained conjecture of some madman, but the bloodless scientific consensus. It isn't something that science can explain, of course, and it makes many scientists deeply uncomfortable, right? Because they want to continue on in their materialism, but the fine-tuning in this universe and on this planet doesn't allow materialism to continue if we're going to deal with it honestly. The problem is the majority don't deal with it honestly. But there it is. An incomprehensibly outrageous scientific fact that stymies any thinking person into silence. What is there to say? But why should we jump into the deep end of the pool so soon? The mass of the universe is only one element on the fine-tuning, and yes, it's frightening to any sensitive thinking person, but there are dozens, and even now scores and hundreds of variables that are fine-tuned, albeit not quite to that disturbing level. For example, let's talk for a moment about the 4 fundamental forces in the universe. Those forces are gravity, the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force. So, most of us who aren't physicists don't know about the 4 fundamental forces, but they are as important as anything we can imagine, since they hold the universe together. Holding They're down to holding together every single atom in the universe. For clarity, these forces are gravity, the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force. Paul Davies has touched on the fine-tuning of these four forces specifically. Quote by Davies, "It's hard to resist the impression that the present structure of the universe, apparently so sensitive to minor alterations in the numbers, has been rather carefully thought out. The seemingly miraculous concurrence of numerical values that nature has assigned to her fundamental constants must remain the most compelling evidence for an element of cosmic design." End quote. Of course, nature doesn't typically assign numerical values to things, much less to things established less than a millionth of a second before nature herself exploded into being from nothingness. That's the point. Nature has no intelligence capable of working such things out, nor any will or intention to create anything. And yet each one of these four fundamental forces has a fixed value so precisely calibrated for the universe to come into being that we can hardly resist assuming someone was behind this, someone with infinite intelligence and a pre-existing desire to create the universe in its limitless vastness and variety. Does that sound like anybody you know? One thing we seem to know with dead certainty is this: it could not have happened randomly. No one understands what is involved dreams it just happened any more than the plays of Shakespeare just happened, or the Parthenon just happened, or the Colosseum just happened, or the Great Wall of China just happened, or the Egyptian pyramids just happened. Some things don't just happen. The universe is one of those things that don't just happen, that doesn't just happen. As for these fundamental forces, the only one of the four that everyone understands and experiences is gravity. We have an innate sense of its value, since we know that if it were twice what it is, we would feel twice as heavy as we do now. It's not hard for us to see that gravity has a specific value that could be stronger or weaker. We experience gravity constantly. The other three fundamental forces are much less easy to fathom. But what all four of them have in common is that their value was determined less than a millionth of a second after the Big Bang and has not changed one iota in almost 14 billion years. But the larger point with regard to the fine-tuning is that each of these four forces must be precisely what it is, or the universe would not be able to support life. Now let's start with the strong nuclear force. The strong nuclear force is what keeps protons and neutrons together. You'll remember that protons and neutrons form the nucleus of every atom, and the electrons orbit that nucleus. But if the force magically keeping protons and neutrons together were just 2% weaker than it is, it wouldn't be strong enough to hold the protons and neutrons together at all, and they drift apart, giving us an entire universe consisting only of hydrogen, whose nucleus has only one proton and no neutrons. A universe of only hydrogen would not allow life to exist. But in case that's not impressive enough, we should say that if the same strong nuclear force were just 3% stronger than it is, it would also be disastrous. If the strong nuclear force were just 0.3% stronger than it is, it would cause protons and neutrons to attract each other too much, so they would pile up and create only large nuclei such as are found in the heavier elements. So there'd be no hydrogen at all, and any universe without hydrogen is just as useless as a universe with only hydrogen. No life could exist. Again, this is what science now tells us. Once we accept this, the real question is how can we not wonder how that exceedingly precise value was established in the first place? It happened almost 14 billion years ago in the first millionth of a second after the Big Bang. It's never deviated since, and if it were not precisely what it is, life could not exist. Is that not at least curious? Why did it just happen to be exactly right immediately? And stay what it is immediately, so that the universe could come into being as it has, eventually supporting life on our planet. Let's turn to the electromagnetic force. Turning to the electromagnetic force, we remind ourselves that for life to be possible, we need a whole raft of elements, not just hydrogen, oxygen, iron, helium, nitrogen, and carbon. At a bare minimum, human beings require about 22 different elements. We may remember from chemistry class that the way elements are formed has to do with electrons leaping from the orbits into one atom over to the orbit of another atom. It's the electromagnetic force that keeps the electrons in orbit around their nuclei. So science tells us if this force were slightly weaker, electrons would leave their orbits too easily. But if it were slightly stronger, they would never budge from their original orbits. In either case, For enough elements to exist, this force needs to be perfectly calibrated. And yes, it just happens to be perfectly calibrated, and here we are. But more impressive by far than the calibration of each of these four forces is the perfect calibration of the ratios between them. For example, Paul Davies has calculated that if the ratio between the strong nuclear force and the electromagnetic force were different by 1 part in 10 to the 16th power, life could not exist. This is another inconceivable level of calibration, but this figure is given to us by an agnostic who's one of the top physicists in the world. So he's admitting the fine-tuning. And I may have said earlier that he was an atheist. Well, this now says that he's an agnostic. Of course, an agnostic is one who says that they're not sure whether or not there's a God. I think for the theist, you don't even have to be a Christian, of course, to be a theist. But when you look at the design, among other things, it becomes unmistakable that there must be a designer. Once we accept if Davies is an agnostic, he's saying he is not sure whether or not there is a God. According to Davies, if this ratio were different by that infinitesimally tiny amount, the universe as we know it would not exist. Why haven't we heard of all this before? If the ratio between the strong nuclear force and electromagnetic force were different by that minuscule amount, life could not exist. But life does exist, so there's not that difference between the strong nuclear force and electromagnetic force. They are exactly how they are supposed to be for life to exist. Let's look at one more ratio between these two forces. Between two of these forces. Let's look at one more ratio between two of these forces, the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force. We know that a universe that did not contain enough large stars and small stars would not permit life. Large stars are necessary because in their interiors, life-essential elements like iron are produced, without which life could not exist. Iron is required to form DNA in every plant and animal and is required to make hemoglobin, which delivers oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our body and delivers carbon dioxide from our body's tissues to our lungs. Iron is also required for innumerable other things, but iron is only produced in stars called supergiants, meaning they are anywhere from 10 to 70 times the size of our sun. Eventually, after literally billions of years, they explode into supernova, releasing all of their iron and other things into the universe, which is how all the iron in our bodies and our planet got here. Wow. Although that was, of course, a long, long time ago. But we also need small stars like our sun, which is able to burn steadily for billions of years, and we need small stars. We need stars smaller than our sun, too. But for such a variety of stars to exist depends on the ratio between the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force. As you may have guessed, this just so happens to be perfectly fine-tuned. The ratio between the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force must be exact, down to 1 part in 10 to the 40th power. 1 followed by 40 zeros is a painfully large number. If we said the ratio couldn't be different by 1 in a million, 10 to the 6th power, anyone would understand that this ratio is astronomically fine-tuned. A million or a billion are numbers we can begin to understand, or at least fool ourselves into thinking we understand. But 1 followed by 40 zeros? Yet that's what physicists insist is required for small stars and large stars to exist so that our lives could be possible. Wow. Hugh Ross gives an illustration that might help us appreciate what 1 in 10 to the 40th means. Ross tells us to imagine covering contiguous United States and Alaska with dimes. When you're done, cover Canada in dimes too. Both American dimes and Canadian dimes work equally well. Then cover Mexico and half of Central America just to be safe. Now repeat the process until the dimes are piled so high that Mount McKinley's not visible. That's roughly 20,000 feet high. Then continue this process till the dimes are 12 times higher than Mount McKinley. There's Mount McKinley. And Mount McKinley is 240,000 feet high. Okay, now continue the process until the dimes are 5,000 times higher than that. That would make them 240,000 miles high, at which point they'd be bumping into the moon. Don't worry about it because no one lives on the moon. Once this is completed, do the same thing with a billion other continents the size of North America, piling the dimes 240,000 miles high on each continent. If you can't find any continents exactly the size of North America, join the club. Now you should have a billion areas, the equivalent of North America, covered with dimes to the altitude of 240,000 miles. If you've missed any of the billion continents, now's the time to go back and make sure you've covered all billion. Once you're sure you have covered all that you need to cover. Once you're sure you've covered all you need to cover, tell a friend that among the dimes covering these billion continents to the height of the moon, there is somewhere a single red dime. It could be on any of the billion continents at any level within the moon high piles. Refuse to tell your friend the answer no matter how close you are. So if you can imagine that a single red dime somewhere in those moon-high piles covering a billion continents the size of North America, you have a solid idea of what the maximum amount of deviation can be in the ratio between the gravitational and electromagnetic forces in order for life to exist. In other words, there can't be deviation, basically. Otherwise, life couldn't exist. Many other fine-tuned variables are nearly as crazy or worse, and we have to remind ourselves that if any one of these variables is wrong, the whole universe would vanish along with life. This is what science has determined. Every one of these variables must be precisely calibrated. We might finally mention that if the value of the gravitational force were different by 1 part in 10 to the 34th power, the universe wouldn't have any planets capable of sustaining life. All these levels of fine-tuning are what science insists are absolutely necessary for life to exist on our planet, however preposterous it might sound. But there's one more level of fine-tuning we should mention. The American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg is an atheist with a particular disdain for religion. Before he was able to accept the Big Bang, he admitted that the steady-state theory was philosophically the most attractive theory because it least resembles the account given in Genesis. But Weinberg nonetheless admits that life as we know it would be impossible if any one of the several physical quantities had slightly different values, as we've been saying. But nothing we've mentioned can compare to the number Weinberg has determined to be the most fine-tuned constant yet discovered. In talking about the energy density of the universe, what is often referred to as the cosmological constant, he gives us the most extravagantly grotesque number of them all, and the most confounding example of fine-tuning. Weinberg says that if the value of this cosmological constant were different by just 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, life could not exist. But what are we to make of a 1 followed by 120 zeros? 1 part in a million is only followed by 6 zeros. A trillion is a 1 followed by 12 zeros. A quadrillion is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. A quintillion is a 1 followed by 18 zeros. From there we go to a sextillion, a 1 followed by 21 zeros. And a septillion, a 1 followed by 24 zeros. And an octillion, 1 followed by 27 zeros. Who has use for such numbers? Since we had some ink to spare, we can spell it out. We're talking about a deviation of 1 part in that. Pause the video and count them up if you like. Can there be any real point to such a surfeit of zeros? The number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th power. Our universe is 93 billion light years in diameter. 1 light year is about 6 trillion miles. Our minds cannot begin to fathom these things. But these are simply what science, advanced as it now is, requires that we accept. So at what point do we see that our existence, logically speaking, cannot be anything close to a random occurrence? We've not mentioned that each of these outlandish numbers must be multiplied by all the others to get the full picture. We get a number so impossibly large that there can be no way to imagine that our universe and our planet and we ourselves are simply here. But science says that changing any one of the parameters mentioned, even slightly, would destroy the ability for life to exist. So simply to shrug and say that this all simply happened by chance seems beyond the pale. Saying that must be infinitely dumber than what Jim Carrey's character in Dumb and Dumber says after being told by the pretty girl that the chances of her dating him are 1 in a million. So you're telling me there's a chance. No, not really. No, There is not a chance. There is not a chance that we are here by a random occurrence. We are here because there is design behind this universe. We are here because there's a God who created us in his image and has put a conscience in us and has put us in this universe in which he can be discovered and sent his son to die for us, to live, to die, to rise again. So if we put our faith in him, we can pass from death to life. That's the truth. Chapter 5 is next, where we discuss water and sunlight and how the fine-tuning of water and sunlight contributes to the discussion. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.